All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, you guys can do better than that. This is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah. All right. We got a big discussion coming up this afternoon. Thanks so much for taking the time to come out. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. That's fantastic. Yeah. So, hey, we're going to talk a little bit today. This is a talk that's sponsored by the Maritime Hacking Village. We're going to talk about the intersection from a policy perspective of what's happening out in the Indo-Pacific region. We face a tremendous adversary in terms of China and their growth and competition in this space. And it's happening in the backdrop of this maritime industry that provides 90% of the goods movement around the world. It provides for the U.S. $5.4 trillion in annual economic value. So this is a big national economic issue. This is a big national security issue. And so the folks that we have up here to help fill in the context of this are two phenomenal experts in this area. We have Adam Segal, who is the Ira Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security, and the Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, and has been studying China and Chinese tech policy and initiatives for, I think, probably the last 2 decades or so. And has a couple of books out on the topic as well, and so I commend those to you, but you can read more about his bio on Hacker Tracker. We're also, I would say the last thing with Adam is he's been with CFR for a while, but recently spent some time in the Department of State where he put together the international cyberspace and digital policy for the U.S. government. And so really just a wealth of insight and recent perspective as well. So thanks, Adam, for joining us. And then to my immediate right, joined by Dr. Michael Sulmeyer. Michael is currently starting as a professor of practice at Georgetown University's Foreign Services Security Studies program in this fall. But I think he's really well known for his time as the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy and as the principal cyber advisor to the Secretary of Defense. He's been around the business for a long time and has a really good insight of how the government's organized. What's our military power in this realm? What does our domestic and homeland security force look like? And so we'll hear a little bit about that from Michael as well. And so without any further ado, Adam, maybe if you could get us started, what do we need to know about, where China is and where they're headed and what that means for the U.S. vis-a-vis cyber, tech, the maritime industry, a little bit of everything in there.
Sure. Cold one. Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. 2012, Xi Jinping comes into power and essentially says China is a big network power, but we have to become a superpower, a super cyber power. And essentially, he begins that process by domestically revising a whole range of cybersecurity and national security laws domestically. They reorganize the People's Liberation Army, create the strategic support forces, start focusing on how you integrate cyber with electronic, with psychological, with space warfare, with information warfare, all things together. They increase domestically their access to 0 days and other vulnerabilities by tapping into cybersecurity researchers, force Chinese cybersecurity researchers to give most of the vulnerabilities they find to the Chinese state, cutting them off from international competitions, and put lots and lots of money in developing in the private sector. So we see him really pushing China up the ladder for cyber power, particularly focused on probably 2 different scenarios. The main one is Taiwan, right? The People's Republic of China considers Taiwan a part of China, and then a South China Sea incident around competing maritime interests around fishing and oil and natural gas in that region. PLA has reportedly been said be ready to take Taiwan by 2027, but there's a whole range of blockade, quarantine actions that are probably much more likely than a full amphibious invasion. So China is going to be focused on cyber both domestically in Taiwan and then all of those countries that might come to Taiwan's assistance, primarily the United States, but also Japan and South Korea, where U.S. forces are based. They're looking at command and control. They're looking at critical infrastructure. And in part, they want to weaken the Taiwanese people's ability to resist and willingness to resist. So there'll be lots of information operations about what's actually happening. And then for the U.S., they will do similar things, right? We've seen with Volt Typhoon preparation to place things on critical infrastructure in case they have to reach out and touch the U.S. In a scenario, but also in Guam and other places in Southeast Asia where U.S. will want to try to organize troops and forces, and as well as information operations inside the United States, again, to try to dissuade the U.S. people from moving there. So I'll stop there unless there's anything else you want to add.
Maybe you mentioned Volt Typhoon, but maybe not everybody in the audience is familiar with what it is and what it means and how it might be different. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So Volt Typhoon is what the U.S. government and Microsoft calls a series of Chinese state actors who are pre-positioning malware on critical infrastructure. U.S. government has consistently said that the purpose of that is not espionage, right? It is pre-positioned malware to create disturbances, disrupt critical infrastructure, perhaps to cause societal chaos or other types of disruption in case of a conflict.
Yeah, thanks so much. And so, Michael, we'll come over to you at this point because Adam's painted a pretty serious picture of an adversary that has increased their capability steadily over the course of the last several decades. How's the U.S. Organized and prepared and getting after this threat?
Terrific. Yeah, serious indeed, John. So thanks very much for having me. It's great to be back at DEF CON after a few years. John did not introduce John to you, so let me just take a second to say that John had many decades of distinguished service in the Coast Guard. We met when he occupied a critical role at United States Cyber Command, and I was the advisor to the Commander Cybercom Director NSA. John was had the cool title of J7, which sounds like a Russian orange juice, but is actually the job that is responsible for all the training and force generation of military cyber forces. So how does the Navy take a sailor and make them a hacker? How does the Army take a soldier and an infantryman and make them a hacker? John had to figure all that out. And that's hard to do. So, as the new guy, who had just come in from academia, John was exceptionally kind in sharing his time and insights with me and loved working with him. So when he called to propose doing this, you have to say yes. And of course, anytime I get a chance, to be with Adam on a panel too, for me, having the role of being a national security and really defense person first and a cyber operations person second, I love being with area specialists. That is, you don't want to go into big conversations with people like the Secretary of Defense or briefing at the sit room, just having a cyber conversation. Because most of the people you're talking to are not cybersecurity people. They may know a lot more about China, or they may know a lot more about Russia. So Adam's got this really unique blend, having lived in Beijing at a very critical time. He's got some amazing stories about that, but also knows the digital and infosec world very well. So it's really a treat to be with these two gentlemen here with you. After what Adam was saying in terms of the threat picture, I think it's important to describe a little bit about how the U.S. military is set up to try to deal with what Adam was talking about. You can ask questions if you want after about what the role of Homeland Security or the FBI is. I wasn't the Assistant Secretary of DHS or FBI, so that's not my brief. I was the Defense Department guy, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. But ask whatever you want afterwards. I probably won't answer, but ask whatever you want afterwards. The key thing, to realize about the military cyber force is three core missions. First, the military has got to defend its own networks. That's not your networks. Sorry. The military has got to defend its own networks. For the military to be able to respond in case of a war somewhere around the world, the military's comms have to work. Commanders have to be able to communicate with units. The national leadership has to be able to communicate with commanders. The military's got to be able to protect its own networks from cyber threats. So thing one, make sure the rest of the military can do its job. It's not a controversial point I'm making. I'm just trying to emphasize for you in the order of imperatives and priorities you have. First things first, right? Make sure you can actually command and control or see to your force. Second, have to be able to generate offensive options for different kinds of commanders to use in case there's a war. Right? So you got to defend the networks, and then you also have to be prepared along with infantry units and figure out how to use infantry, along with Navy ships, how do you use Navy ships in case Kyrgyzstan is invaded tomorrow? Made that up. How do you make sure you can use cyber forces in case Kyrgyzstan is invaded tomorrow? That's another part of U.S. Cyber Command's role. Remember, it's a military command. It's not a homeland, it's not law enforcement, it's not a day-to-day thing. It's preparing for the worst case, the last line of defense. Third, it has to defend the nation from significant cyber attacks. I'll just say that's deliberately a little vague, but it's vague, right? But it means that in addition to the role of preparing for conflict, we also know that in cyberspace there's a lot of malicious activity going on today, and that the military, even below the use of force, even below acts of war, that's not a real thing, that's just jargon, but even below the destructive style David Sanger, I'm watching a movie on HBO type of cyber attacks, there's a lot going on. Schools are getting ransomwared, right? Power grids are getting intruded into and malware being placed. There's got to be a role for the expertise in the U.S. Department of Defense to be able to contribute. That may not be in the course of on-net operations, but there's got to be a way to contribute. So that's what we call that defend the nation mission, which is to really make sure we're supporting other parts of the government to be helpful. What I think is fascinating when we talk about the Navy domain, the seas, first is that you invited me because I was the Army principal cyber advisor. And so I'm really good at like land stuff and hacking from tanks, but ships, that was kind of, again, outside my brief for those 2.5 years. But in this situation, the Navy, I think, and a lot of folks involved in the maritime world struggle on two accounts when looking at cyber threats that Adam was talking about. First, there is an instinct among non-InfoSec people to look at these kinds of problems as actually IT problems. And so they hand these problems to the CIOs, or they hand it to what in the military jargon, we'll call your SIC shop, or your comms people, your people who equip a commander with a BlackBerry, right? I'm saying BlackBerry, right? Like you feeling me here? Like I'm old tech, right? So that community of comms people, of communications, I'm being a little flip, so apologies to any SIC shop people, but that is thinking about the threat in terms of availability, in terms of their job is make sure a commander doesn't yell at someone, usually the six, to say, why isn't my damn BlackBerry working, right? That is one kind of cyber threat, but it's usually because someone tripped over a cable or plugged the blue plug into the red port, right? That's a different kind of problem than really what Adam is talking about. So the Navy has struggled about how to generate and deal with, generate the people to deal with cyber threats because they have thought of it more as like a CIO problem, like an IT management issue. They've also struggled because they think of it as an intelligence function. They don't think of it necessarily as a power projection function. They think of it as a way to collect information, as a domain to pick up signals about what an adversary is doing. It's a domain where you can observe what an adversary is preparing to do. That is true, but that's not all it's able to do, right? And so for looking at how a China-Taiwan scenario might play out and how in the Pacific theater A lot of ocean. The Navy's in charge. The Army, there's not a lot of land. Some islands, not a lot of land. So the Navy's in charge. I think the biggest thing we'll want to keep an eye on is how do these two cultural barriers I talk about evolve so that they can actually treat cyberspace as a domain in which you can actually project power and which you're vulnerable to the theft of information, being spoofed through information operations, which are not CIO type, how many Office 365 license. Those are different kinds of questions, right, than just IT provision. And so that's what the Navy's going to have to work through over the next couple years, in addition to the other services. But I think the Navy's in a particular place on that.
We're going to have to come back to that because it opens up the door for a couple of questions there. But first, let me go back to Adam. Adam, you talked about Xi's pursuit of technology, growth and investment. I think about, for a long period of time, it seemed like part of that strategy was stealing intellectual property from others and then copying it, duplicating it. And there's always been some questions, and maybe it's just a moot point about does that actually lead to innovation, or does that just, give you a leg up and you still have an innovation problem? We saw DeepSeek came out and then, raises the question again, hey, is this new innovation or is this just copying? And so what are your thoughts on, are we seeing an innovative China? Is it a different threat than we've seen in the past? Thanks.
Yeah, so it has been very hard traditionally to track specific thefts of intellectual property to breakthroughs on the Chinese side, right? They clearly got into a lot of the defense industry base. Their stealth airplane looks a lot like our stealth airplanes, but that probably is in some way shaped by physics, right? You're not going to be that different on those things. The number of cases where we've seen really dramatic breakthroughs were not cyber-enabled espionage, they were insider threats, right? So there's a great example from American Superconductor, which is a wind farm business in Boston. They had software that managed wind farms. They had a Chinese customer. The customer said, we're no longer doing business with you. There's a cutoff of several hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business. The next month, they are up running that's very, very similar software. Turns out that they had somebody inside the company who was now living in Beijing in a very nice new apartment. So those cases are pretty easy to track to, but on cyber-enabled, much, much harder. But the fact that they keep doing it suggests that they are getting some value out of it, right? They probably would not be spending all of the resources that they're doing on it to keep doing those functions. That said, I don't think it's a significant contribution to how the economy is becoming more and more innovative over time, right? I suspect that it has much more to do with the fact that they have doubled their budgets for R&D over the last 2 decades, that they have managed to, tens of thousands of Chinese students and professors who studied in the United States and Australia and Europe went back. They brought back their expertise and they managed to set up labs there. The Chinese under Xi have said, here are the critical technologies.
Good point.
Thank you. Yeah. Here are the critical technologies where we have to be competitive, and they've thrown a huge amount of resources there. And so it's not surprising that they've moved up the value chain there. So they're definitely, definitely closing the gap. We can get into the specifics of DeepSeek if we want, but I think, with AI, it's clear that Chinese models are as close to being competitive, if not more competitive in some measures than U.S. models are. So I don't think there's a lot of gap there.
Can I make a note on what Adam was saying in terms of the insider threats as a distinct thing from remote computer network operations? I think for the InfoSec community, not at a theoretical level, but at an applied level, if you're in the InfoSec world at a company or in government, and you're a cybersecurity person, if there's an insider threat, they're also coming for you. Like leadership is not going to say, oh, let's hold the physical security team accountable for that failure. Because very likely the insider used a thumb drive or authorized access, but due to poor network segmentation or anything, like, was able to abuse that authorized access. At some point, today's insider threats are actually also cyber and infosec threats. And I think the way that we tend to structure security teams, at least that I've seen at companies and certainly in government, is we think of this as distinct. And we hold different people accountable for setting different policies and different rules and different kinds of oversight and vetting. And I don't think that's prudent. And I think the Chinese and what we've seen in some of our other competitors are very, very skilled at blending methods of intrusion. And we need to be able to adapt to protect ourselves as well.
Yeah, fantastic.
No, actually.
No, I appreciate that. It's not fantastic. It's a gap. And it seems that our adversaries are exploiting, but thanks. You talked a little bit that you're here representing, well, not representing the Department of Defense, but you're here speaking from the perspective of the Department of Defense. You're not speaking from the perspective of DHS or other folks here at home. But then you also talked about DOD's role in defending. And so I think, we saw from 2018 to 2020 a market shift in kind of what it meant to defend the nation. And so how does that play, this idea of defend forward or persistent engagement? How does that play out? What is it, and how does it play out vis-a-vis, competition to conflict with China?
Yeah. No, it's a particularly complicated issue for the military. And because we have a legal system that is set up to give different agencies in our government different authorities, all that was set up before there was the cyber, right? And so we are operating in a kind of macro legal framework that was created before the WWW. Right? And it makes it difficult then to impose costs on adversaries in ways that you have to still reflect those statutory boundaries. But the military is allowed to do certain things. The intelligence community is allowed to do certain things. Law enforcement is allowed to do certain things. Those are often geographically limited and bordered. And as you know, if you're here, or at least still here in this talk, cyberspace and the relationship to physical geography, there are physical implications and boundaries in cyberspace, but largely it disrespects the legal way we divide up who does what in the government. And so thinking of it in terms of not a geographical boundary space that doesn't respect the way we separate domestic and international functions makes it very difficult. And so what we started to see Cyber Command created right in 2010 is the military command to manage the defense of all of the department, all of the military's networks. But we started to see in 2015, 2016, 2017 was malicious foreign entities, sometimes overtly state-controlled, sometimes proxies, sometimes kind of odd, attacking, penetrating, compromising U.S. companies, U.S. entities, our allies, but not in ways that were explosive. They weren't killing people. They weren't blowing things. Again, it wasn't fireworks, but intellectual property theft, ID theft, right? Just over and over cumulative effects. And leadership kept looking at the military, saying, we have this thing called Cyber Command. Stop it. Make it stop. And the military having to say, hold it. You don't use a sledgehammer to deal with an ant we actually have to figure out the right tools to deal with these kinds of new problems. And we didn't have the statutory clarity or the policy clarity to actually use the military in ways that were below the level of armed conflict. No one wanted to start a war with China over intellectual property theft. It's a very important issue. But no one wanted to actually go to war with China over intellectual property theft. That's probably a smart call, right? I'm not a China guy. He's the China guy. But I'm just telling you, there's probably bigger issues at play. So that's a big one, but there's a lot of big issues. And so eventually the Congress modified a particular provision of the law. Eventually the civilians in the Defense Department not on my time, changed the policy to be more, allow the military to be more proactive below the level of armed conflict. And this really started to play out for the first time in defense of the 2018 midterm elections. That was the first test with these new authorities and these new imprimatur to actually go forward and disrupt malicious activity before it hit the homeland. And, you know, I think that the track record ever since has been just the need to do more and more and more, because the threat isn't going down, it's just the need to make sure that we are more proactively engaging and disrupting as opposed to responding after something happens. You want to disrupt it, get ahead of it, prevent it, preempt it. You want to be in that world. You don't want to be in the world of clean up on aisle 7 and what do we do after? Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
What's happened?
So I just want to make the point that, and all what Michael said is true, but when we have these discussions when we have discussions on the U.S. side, we're always talking about the constraints that we thought that we had, right? We didn't have the authorities, and we had certain legal restrictions. We didn't have the force projection. The Chinese didn't believe any of it, right? They believed in 2012 that they were operating from an extreme position of weakness, and they continue to operate in a position of weakness. Now that has changed somewhat over time, but certainly looking at 2012 to 2018-19, they were basically saying, look, the world uses U.S. technology, so that gives you a home field advantage. And all the things you say you're not doing, we know you're out there hacking all the time. And Snowden for them was a huge shock, right? The Snowden disclosures essentially reinforced in their mind that the U.S. could have access to data anywhere. And so while focusing on the kind of constraints on the U.S. side is right, the Chinese always thought that they were the weaker power.
I would say those constraints, though, are historic. That was a point about that transition to 2018. Now I would not say those are not constraints anymore, and the Chinese can be comfortable now that there are not those constraints on our force.
Fair enough. Good. Adam, I was wondering, Belt and Road Initiative and taking control of or asserting control and influence over key choke points is such a key issue for maritime security, maritime policy. And so what's been the role of tech or economic influence, do you think, from the Chinese side in trying to grasp some of that control?
Yeah, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative was a huge focus. It was ports, right? Building out ports through Pakistan and to Africa, and getting Chinese access to those ports, as well as rail lines running up and down Southeast Asia, connecting to those ports. So we see that infrastructure side playing a huge role to it. That kind of build has become less popular, right? It's less popular in Belt and Road Initiative countries because of this huge investments that it took, overspending, lots of problems with civil society in lots of these countries, right? So Chinese, at the first wave of that, would bring in their own construction workers, and so displace local workers. There's been a big shift to digital infrastructure. It's cheaper, right? So you see a lot of work around satellite and fiber optics, and then 5G, of course, and most of these places 3G and 4G, but also 5G build out. So, the Chinese are building the infrastructure, gaining access to it. I think they also heard, I think it was General Hayden who said, referring to after Snowden and, Microsoft, you're going to take advantage of what's in your backyard, referring to the relationship with the U.S. tech companies. And I think the Chinese essentially said that, well, if we push out Chinese technology out to those places, we'll have similar advantages, right? We'll have similar control of those choke points. To use the language of Henry Farrell and Abe Newman of weaponized interdependence, they'll have those access to computer, to networks and other things there.
Yeah, thanks. Good. All right. Michael, let me come back to you because you mentioned that you think one of the challenges that we're going to face in the Pacific is somewhat of a service cultural challenge of properly framing the problem, right? You said Navy, if I heard you correctly, the Navy may look at this as a IT, or look at cyber as traditionally as an IT or an intel problem, not a force projection. So, do we have the right authorities? Do we have the right service organization to get after this?
Look, I think we do, because it's not World War II anymore. And, well, that is an obvious point. I mean that by way of saying that we don't defend the country anymore by just having the Navy do one thing and the Army do one thing and the Air Force with some airplanes try to do one thing. We actually do integrate this stuff, right? So the Air Force now does talk to the Army. The Army does now talk to the Navy, right? So all the services struggle to a certain degree or another. Probably the Space Force, the least amount of struggle, because they're so new and sort of built with this kind of technology at a foundational level. But the strategy that I think we have to pursue across all of the services is really three things. You have to first generate the insights needed to be able to both generate and options to better defend the networks and harden those networks, and to be able to then use those insights to impose cost. Those are the three steps. You have to be able to generate insights on your own. That is, you can do that with partners, working with private sector threat intelligence partners. You can do that through a really cool, like, government-only means, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is, you've got to be able to generate the kind of insight and information you need to then, number two, harden your networks quickly based on what you learn, based on those insights. You have to be able to adapt defenses not in months, but in hours. And then you have to also be able to use those insights quickly to generate offensive options for consideration, right? And be ready to go if a commander or the senior most decision maker says, let's do it. You can't leave that for weeks and weeks and weeks, because in this domain, obviously, it's not everything so fleeting. It's not just use it or lose it. I think that's too dramatic. But it's also not just a stationary standoff weapon, and the target, maybe it moves around on a rail thing or not, but these targets move around, they change IP addresses, a computer reboots, someone patches something, and all of a sudden you're out. So you do need to be able to move faster than the traditional cycle. How do you do that? How do you generate insights and use that to harden defenses and impose costs quickly? Well, first, you do have to have the technology. And on that, I'm very, very confident on the U.S. position. Two, you got to have the talent. Again, I'm confident, but you cannot be in this conference, you cannot be in this world without acknowledging that the retention challenges of keeping really, really skilled people in public service is hard, because private sector opportunities are legit and those are real. What we have found is that when really good people leave, this doesn't apply to the masses, but when our really, really good people want to leave, it's not just because of money. It's because they were being asked to do, or ordered, we don't really call it asking in the military, you ordered to do something in terms of a mission that you really don't want to do. So if we've invested millions in you to become an operator or an analyst in this world, and then we tell you, you know what your next job is going to be? You're going to go paint the battleship gray. Or you're going to go drive that tank around the desert. I mean, how does that make you feel? If you're wearing the uniform, you're making sacrifices. We need to find the right pathways in terms of talent management and career management, so that if you want to serve, and we're so be able to be honored to have that service, we have to make sure we can actually build a career around you and that interest, and keep you progressing, keep you getting promoted. And so that was a huge area of work that I was undertaking when I was assistant secretary. So from the capabilities, I think we're good. From talent, we have it, we got to keep it. And that's our hardest part. And third, finally, is the ability to have partnerships with the private sector. I am not just a person who likes partnerships for the sake of fricking partnerships. The rule I have was generally 1 + 1 has to equal more than 2. Everybody loved coming by saying, we want to partner with you crazy cyber people, because we don't know what you do, but it sounds not right. And, if we do that, we get nothing else done. other than signing memos with partners. That's fine. What I'm really trying to get our folks to do is who are the kinds of partners that we need, where 1 + 1, us working together, will actually yield results that neither of us could pull off if we were just working alone. Those are rare. You got to go work on those. It's not just having a meeting with someone from like AWS or Microsoft or Google. That's not partnering. And I'm talking about really having a clear sense of operational outcomes and objectives, and then figuring out, based on those objectives, who is best placed. Foreign partners, domestic companies, other parts of the government, whatever it is. How do you actually strike those collaborative relationships? So that's why I'm actually quite optimistic, John.
Yeah. Okay. Mic drop. There you go. Adam, we are coming up on time here. So let me kick it over to you. We covered a lot of territory, but we really probably missed some key points too. And so I just have an open-ended comment over to you for anything that you would share.
And then you can, Michael.
Yes, yeah. I'll just.
That's right.
I guess for this audience, the most interesting thing is like we've clearly seen a progression and phases of Chinese capabilities in hacking, right? So in the earliest stage, it was mostly IP theft directed. It was pretty sloppy, mass hacking, right? The metaphor that, or simile, whatever it was, that Comey used, right, is that Chinese hackers are the drunk burglar who knocks over the vase while they're stealing your flat screen television, right? They just kept trying and trying. That kind of wave ended with the agreement between Obama and Xi about cyber-enabled theft. The Chinese used that year to really reorganize, shift some of the sloppy stuff away from the PLA to the Ministry of State Security, and they got better, right? We started seeing Cloud Hopper and other going after IT services much more directed, and the growth of the commercial sector. So we're seeing that now. So a lot of reliance on iSoon and all of these other contractors there. And now we're seeing this third phase around Volt Typhoon about pre-positioning, right? So getting ready for a defensive thing. So we're now entering, and they were doing some probably pre-positioning beforehand. There was that hacking of, oil pipelines in the 2000 aughts, I think, where we're exactly sure what they were doing in those networks. But we've seen evolution. We're gonna continue to see evolution there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Now can we cold call for questions here?
Yeah, we got time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience if you want to do it. All right, let's go. Well, we got to get you to speak up a little bit, so we got it. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I really liked your analogy about the fire ants. We use a similar one in the field that I've worked in, where when we were talking about the smashing hammer, the sledge, that you can't deal with an ant with a sledgehammer. Yes, it is a good analogy because that tends to be how, at least in my experience, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the CCP tends to operate when it comes to threat, right? They're not going to do something big and loud and scary. It's all these little things, and we compared it to being at a picnic, and you're sitting at a picnic table and you see 1 or 2 ants and it's not a really big deal, but then after a while you realize you're sitting at a fire ant pile and it's too late. And so with that being said, we're talking a lot about how Belt and Road Initiative is kind of being moved away from. It's they're advancing a little bit more and will continue to. Would you say there's anything coming up on the horizon that you've been seeing that's particularly concerning coming out of that region that we should be aware of? I know we have, of course, cranes, we have, the hacking situations. Is there anything that was not really being talked about that should be?
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Cranes, pro or con?
I'm pro cranes. Yeah, pro cranes. So I mean, a lot of this is out of our control, right? In the sense that things happen in domestic politics in Taiwan, in China, and the United States. And we may have to react to those things in ways that we're just not prepared for. I think that's probably the most likely thing, is that the Taiwanese could make some decision that the Chinese interpret as moving closer to independence, and the next thing you know, they have escalated in ways that we see as being particularly threatening, and then we're in a place that we don't really want to be. I don't follow the TTPs closely enough to know if there's anything out there that we should be particularly looking at. But I would say that it's going to be something political that we're not expecting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, I think with that one, what we're going to do is we're going to bring this one to a close. So please give a warm round of applause to our panelists. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in continuing the dialogue, first of all, our panelists will stick around for a few minutes, but there's a great discussion coming up from the Naval War College's Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute that is really focused on, hey, let's take a deep dive on this particular Taiwan scenario and really try and understand how to how to think about the challenges and steps that we can take. So I think that they will shed some light on that. I'd also encourage you to come on down to the Maritime Hacking Village and spend some time not only talking with our policy experts, but getting on keyboard and helping us to secure this industry. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.